Can y'all hear me? Yes? Yeah, okay. Well, welcome back. I'm sure that many of you are just getting back from the beaches and other fabulous places for spring break. I just got back from San Francisco this morning, so I'm a little bit jet lagged, but I'll try to make sure that this is interesting and engaging for you. So as Dr. Strauss mentioned, I am a doctoral student here in the Department of Health Behavior and Health Education. And for the last better part of 12 years, I've been engaged in HIV prevention in some way, shape, or form. So this has really been a big passion of mine. So it's really an honor to be able to talk about some of the things that have been consuming my mind and my thought process for many years. And to hopefully leave you all with some information that you can use to empower your communities in the work that you all do. I know that many of you will go off and to do other things not related to public health, but I think that this is a conversation that is relevant around HIV for everyone. So hopefully this will be fun. And I do encourage you to stop me if there are things that are unclear. I really like to do lectures more as a dialogue. I think that it's more interesting for everyone involved. So with that, I'll go ahead and get started. So I'll start out with just a brief overview of the epidemiology of where we are with HIV in Black and African American communities here in the States. I'm sure that many of you have seen the numbers, so we'll go through that pretty quickly. And really what I want to focus the bulk of my talk on is kind of understanding why are we seeing such high rates of HIV infection in Black communities, and sort of understanding what does the research tell us and what do we know about future directions. I want to spend a little bit of time, not a whole lot of time, but a little bit of time debunking one of the kind of popularly promoted rationales behind why we see such high rates of HIV in Black communities, which is this whole concept of the down low. And we'll spend some time going through that. And then I want to just leave with some next steps for how we might move forward in the fight against HIV as it relates to Black communities, and then open up the floor for questions. But again, I do encourage you all to ask questions throughout if there are things that are unclear. So again, this is probably very familiar to most of you here in the room. So we have about 1.2 million folks here in the US who are living with HIV. And it's estimated about a quarter of those folks don't know they have HIV. And I'm sure you heard from Dr. Cohen already, so he's talked to you a little bit about why that's such an opportunity for us, is that we know when folks know their HIV status, they take precautions to protect themselves and their partners from future HIV transmission, and also can take advantage of life-saving therapy. So we want to make sure that we reduce this number of people who do not know their HIV status. And you'll hear me come back to that point throughout the talk. We have about 56,000 new cases of HIV every year. This is a relatively new estimate. For about 10 years, the mantra had been that we had about 40,000 new cases of HIV every year. And CDC went back and did some fancy mathematical modeling and figured out that they were actually off by a fairly significant margin in terms of the number of HIV infections that we have every year. So that's a pretty accurate estimate. And that's been steady now for the last 5 or so years. About 48% of new HIV cases are attributable to folks who don't know their status. So again, testing and knowing your status is really crucial. And again, kind of the big story here, and this is probably the big take-home point from the lecture here, is that about half of all HIV infections in the United States occur in Black people. And in North Carolina, that's further exacerbated with about 67% of the cases occurring among Black folks. So just to kind of put this in a broader global context, I know you've heard a little bit from folks that are doing global HIV work, but if all the Black people in the United States were their own freestanding nation, we would rank 16th in the world in terms of the number of people living with HIV. So again, that kind of puts this in a broader context. I think when we talk about HIV, especially for folks that are kind of focused more on HIV as it affects other parts in the world, we forget that there are really deeply impacted communities here at home, the Black community being chief among them. So again, this is just sort of breaking this out a little bit more. So what you'll notice here on the top line, this is the number of diagnoses. Am I pointing where? Yeah, okay. This is the most recent data from CDC, which goes back to 2009. So again, what you'll see is about the vast majority of cases are within Blacks, and you can see the vast racial disparity between Blacks, whites, and Hispanics here. So again, this is just another graphical representation of just sort of how severe the disparity is here in HIV infections. So this is just looking at, again, breaking this out by gender. One of the things that we hear a lot about in the popular press is that, we have more women becoming HIV infected. And a lot of times people think that there are actually more women who are living with HIV than men. And what this graph shows you is that still currently in the US, the vast majority of cases of HIV occur among men. And we notice that the vast majority are among black men. And we can see that among black women, black women represent the lion's share of HIV cases. So again, this is just by gender to sort of see this disparity by race and by gender. So this kind of just shows you the rates of HIV infection by race again, but also compares it to the percentage of the population that different racial groups comprise. So black folks make up 52% of the HIV infections, but only 13% of the US population. So again, 52% of HIV cases, only 13% of the general US population. And this is just among men. So we notice that black men comprise about 13% of all men here, but 47% of HIV cases. In women, the disparity is even greater. So you see that among women, black women comprise 66% of HIV cases, but only 14% of the US population. I think it's also important that we have a geographic focus in our conversation around HIV. Oftentimes we think about HIV as something that happens in urban centers. So it would make sense to most folks that you would have high rates of HIV in our major urban centers. So New York, Los Angeles, San Francisco, people kind of get that. But what people don't know is that actually the vast brunt of the HIV epidemic in the States is actually occurring in the South. And this is really shown really beautifully in this graph that you see here. So what you'll see stand out is the South, above and beyond all the other regions of the country, bears the largest burden in terms of AIDS diagnoses. And what's also really important is that that's not just cities in the South, it's also the rural South. And that presents some really unique challenges for how we think about treatment and prevention. And we're fortunate to be at an institution that really is at the forefront of HIV prevention science and thinking about how we deal with these issues in more rural areas. So again, just to kind of bring this back to the local context for a minute. In North Carolina, we have women comprise about 32% of all HIV cases. And again, you see sort of that same sort of racial disparity there, with 70% of HIV cases among women occurring among black women, 7% among Latino women, and the vast majority of women acquire their infection through heterosexual contact. Among men, we also see racial disparities, with 62% of HIV cases among men in North Carolina being among black men. And actually, compared to other states, we actually have a larger percentage of men who acquire their HIV infection through heterosexual contact, with 23% of men in North Carolina being infected through heterosexual contact. This also just shows you the geographic dispersion of where HIV is in North Carolina. So this is the Triangle region here. So this is Wake County, Durham County, and Orange County. So again, you would sort of expect that we would see higher rates of HIV in our urban counties. So Wake County is where Raleigh is, we have Mecklenburg where Charlotte is. But what surprises a lot of people is that you see really high rates of HIV in rural counties. So this is sort of east of 95. These are more rural counties where we see very high rates of HIV. So again, I think just when we think about how we deal with this, we have much more kind of resource constraints in rural areas. So again, just when you're thinking about kind of, those of you that want to work in public health, working in rural areas presents some unique challenges that require some really creative thinking. And that's true both here in the States and also in other parts of the world. So again, just to kind of summarize what we've seen in terms of the impact of HIV on Black women. So Black women account for about 66% of HIV cases among women. The HIV case rate among Black women is about 20 times that of white women. 74% of women nationally, Black women nationally acquire their HIV through heterosexual contact. And in 2002, HIV was actually the leading cause of death for Black women between the ages of 25 and 34. And while it's not the number one cause of death among Black women in that age bracket today, it still continues to be in the top 5 of causes of death for Black women. So again, I think we oftentimes shift our focus abroad, and I think it's appropriate to do that, but we definitely have a really serious HIV epidemic here in the United States among Black folks, both Black men and Black women. So this is actually hot off the press. This is a study that UNC was one of the sites of called ISIS. And the purpose of this study was to estimate the number of newly acquired HIV infections that occur among women in the United States. We didn't really have a good estimate of that previous to the study result being published. And this is actually hot off the press. This study just came out on Thursday. Where they just released this data. So I just got this from a friend that works at FHI. So this is publicly available, you can talk about it, but this is fresh data. So this was a study of about just a few over 2,000 women of color. 88% were Black, 12% were Latina. And this was done in 6 different areas across the country. And they chose these as, quote, HIV hotspots. So these were areas that were known to have high background rates of HIV prevalence, high rates of poverty. And they wanted to understand, in these really highly affected areas, what's going on with women of color. And so what they found is that the HIV incidence within this cohort of women was 0.24%. And again, that doesn't sound very high, but I think to kind of put that number in context, when you think about HIV incidence in other parts of the developing world, so that's comparable to what you see in the general population in the Congo and also in Kenya. What's also important about this number is that this is 5 times higher than the previous estimate that the CDC had. So again, this isn't necessarily shocking, but I think what it does is it tells us that the HIV epidemic among women of color in the US is actually worse than we thought it was before. So again, newly kind of disturbing results coming out of this project, but I think it provides an opportunity to continue to have a conversation around it. So again, just released data from ISIS. Turning now to Black men. The trends haven't changed all that much, but in 2005, Black men accounted for 64% of the cases among Blacks and 42% of the HIV cases among all men. So again, I think even though we see these racial disparities in HIV infection among men, the number of white men who have HIV is actually greater, although the proportion of Black men who have HIV is greater. So that's an important distinction. So in terms of thinking about kind of where folks are acquiring their infection, the plurality of Black men acquire their HIV through same-sex contact, but also there's a not insignificant number of Black men who become infected through heterosexual contact. So I think there's still this conversation, and we'll come back to this when we talk about the down low a little bit, that you can only get HIV if you are a man who has sex with other men. And in some ways, we in the HIV prevention industry have not done a good job of also messaging to heterosexual men in this country around their risk for HIV. So again, I think we are also to blame in sort of that general public perception that HIV in the US is still a gay disease and a women's disease. What was really disturbing about this data, and again, this is a little bit old from 2005, but this was a study that really, when I read this got me kind of fired up because this came out around the time I really got involved with HIV here in North Carolina. And what they found is in this 5-city study of MSM of all races that of the Black men, 46% of the men that were enrolled in the study were found to be HIV positive. And this was compared to 21% of the white men and 17% of the Latino men. So almost half of the black MSM who were part of the study were infected with HIV. So just by a show of hands, how many people have heard of this study before, this number before? To be provocative, I would say that if this were heterosexual white women, I think there would be many more hands going up that have heard this number before. What was also disturbing about this study was that of the men that were found to be HIV positive, 67% of these men did not know they were infected before they took the test that was part of the study. So again, going back to my earlier comment around the importance of really knowing your HIV status, because if you don't know your status, you can sort of unwittingly continue to infect people without knowing that you're doing it. And it's also important to know that black MSM, or black men who have sex with men, between the ages of 18 and 29, we're actually the only group, if you can think back to the trend lines that I showed you in the beginning of the presentation, they all look pretty steady. But what if you break out the black MSM and put them on their own line, you'd actually see a little bit of an increase between 2006 and 2009. And in fact, black MSM were actually the only subgroup in the United States where we actually saw an increase in HIV infections between 2006 and 2009. So this group, which is the most sort of highly impacted group in the US, is actually the group where we're actually losing ground on HIV prevention. So again, in thinking about where we want to focus our efforts, that's going to be a big focus of it's been a big focus of what we've been doing, but I think even more so, we know that we really have to scale up our efforts at reaching young black MSM. And again, just to kind of underscore that point, in 2009, 48% more black MSM became infected with HIV than in 2006. So again, a population in which we're really losing a little bit of ground when we are seeing such high rates of HIV infection. And this is actually the population that I work with most closely. Dr. Strauss mentioned Project STYLE in the beginning of the presentation. And that was actually a program that was based here at UNC that was focusing on finding young HIV positive MSM of color and linking them into care. So this is a population that I'm very passionate about and really do a lot of work with in trying to figure out what we can do to stem the tide of this epidemic in this community. So I've given you a lot of data, so I just want to take a quick pause and see if there's any immediate questions or things that stood out. All right. So one of the things that's happened, and I think the shift in the conversation in the last couple years has been great. When I first started doing this work, one of the things that kept coming up over and over and over again as to an explanation as to why we're seeing such high rates of HIV in black communities specifically was around this whole conversation of the down low. And what this refers to is men who have sex with both men and women, but don't inform their female partners of their sexual activity with men. And this was sort of, in the popular press, and there are many kind of books written on it. Oprah did a show about it. This became kind of a conversation around why we're seeing such high rates of HIV in the black community. And I think while the conversation has lessened somewhat today, this is still something I hear out in communities. So I think it's really important that when you leave this class, that this is something that you don't continue to kind of promulgate in your conversations, because it's actually not true. So before we go into that, I want to show you a couple of video clips just to kind of get our minds into being critical about these types of analyses that are promulgated in the media. So I'm going to show you two video clips, and I want to ask you a couple questions about them afterwards. So the first clip is actually a trailer for the film Brokeback Mountain. By just a show of hands, how many people have seen this film? So, okay, many people have seen it. All right. Reactions. What did you all see as sort of differences between those two clips?
Some more violence in the second video, I guess.
Mm-hmm. More conflict, okay. Mm-hmm.
Repeat it, because they...
Yeah, so the Brokeback Mountain was more of a love story. Over there?
There was a much greater focus on the second one in like the breaking up of the family versus the actual male relationship in the first one.
So in the second clip, you saw more of a focus on the breakup of the family. What other things did you see as differences between the two clips?
We didn't think about disease with broke back
Okay. So you didn't think about disease in the first clip. What else? Did you see similarities between them?
Well, they both in their relationship, they had to sort of keep it secret.
Okay. Both had to keep it secret? Okay. Any other kind of just top line reactions to what you saw? Okay. So there's a reason I showed you those two clips. So I think one of the things that's been a feature of the conversation around the down low is that it seems like it's seemed to be the exclusive province of black men. And we see that, in both cases, at least the scenario is the same. There are, in both cases, you have men who are perform sort of a heterosexual role, given that they're all married to women, but are also having sex with men. And as one person pointed out, like in one sort of story, it's almost like a love story, and then the second clip is almost kind of like a horror film. If you see, even the music is different. It kind of has this sort of sinister quality to it. But essentially, you're talking about the same type of behavior, but there is a marked difference from the way in which we talk about it when it happens with white men versus how we talk about it when it happens with black men. I also wanted to call your attention to the tagline at the very end of the second clip. And if you get this wrong, I'm not doing my job. So, are those numbers that were presented in the second clip, are those accurate? Right, show of hands. Who says yes, that number is accurate? Who says no? Okay, those are like, no, baby. So it's wrong. Completely, totally wrong, right? So what they did in that number is, remember how I talked to you earlier about how 66% of HIV cases among women are among black women. So they rounded that up to 70% and then added in, like, they got it from down low men. That's a big jump, right? There is actually very little evidence, or if any, that really makes that linkage. So I think, it's really important for those of us who work in these fields to kind of be good consumers of information. And again, this isn't meant to be an educational thing. It's a popular film that would be released to the public. But when you see things like that, sometimes people see that and they take that as truth. Like, oh, that's true because I saw a number, So just be, critical when you see those types of statistics, particularly when they're presented in sort of a popular media type of way, that there really isn't, valid science that goes behind what they presented there. But a lot of people, when I gave this talk, about a year ago, everyone was like, oh yeah, that's true. So I'm glad that you all seem to be a little bit more informed. So again, this conversation around the down lows kind of rests on what I call 4 pillars of mythology. So the first we've kind of already talked about a little bit was that this conversation around the down low was really only applicable to black men. This notion that all men on the down low are HIV positive, and that all black men who have sex with men are on the down low, and then lastly, that down low men are entirely responsible for this rise of HIV that we see in black women and in the black community in general. So I think we've already talked about this, but I thought this was fun. So does anybody remember these two guys? So this is going back a couple years, but the same situation keeps coming up about every 2 months. Like if there is I'm not going to expose my partisan leanings here, but generally we have senators come out who may be more conservative. So this guy actually is Larry Craig, who was a senator from Utah. He was caught in a bathroom back in 2006 or 2007 soliciting sex from another guy, and had this big press conference and mentioned that he had a wide stance because there was some code that, like, if you tap your foot, that means you want sex with the guy, and he said he was just sitting on the toilet and he had a wide stance. So that was a kind of a big kind of thing a couple years ago. The other guy here, this is Jim McGreevey, who is the former governor of New Jersey, which is my home state. Also came out after he was caught sort of putting his boyfriend on state payroll who wasn't qualified for the position. So, but he came out, and for the minute that he was out and governor, he was actually the highest ranking openly gay person ever elected in the U.S. So, but he only did that for like 2 days, sadly. But yeah, he came out, and what was interesting about in the conversation, both these men had their wives present at the press conference when they, disclosed their sexuality. But in nowhere in the media did we worry about, oh my God, like, does Jim McGreevey's wife have HIV, or does she, we didn't wonder those things. We didn't have that kind of conversation. So again, but if we look at kind of what we go by as the definition of down low behavior, both these men fit the bill. So just looking at a little bit more data on this, we actually see, I love in public health, we come up with all these, fancy ways to say, basic things. So this is actually called like sort of non-disclosure of sexuality. So we actually find that the rates of sexual identity non-disclosure, while they are higher among Black MSM, we do find that, there are comparable rates of white and Hispanic men who also don't disclose their same-sex behavior to others. So again, I think, and other researchers looked at this and they found that the rates of non-disclosure are actually pretty comparable across races of men. This next kind of point around sort of the notion that all down low men are HIV positive. And again, we know that men who have sex with men actually do comprise the largest number of HIV patients in the US. And the number of HIV infections among MSM is greater than among other groups. So that's definitely true. And we also know that Black MSM are especially hard hit by the HIV epidemic. However, I think it's really important when you're trying to establish a causal link that you ask the right questions. And so in these studies that assess the prevalence of HIV among MSM, they didn't necessarily ask about whether these men were having unprotected sex with female partners. And that would be a crucial bit of information if you're going to try to make that linkage and to make that argument. So again, kind of digging a little bit deeper into this notion around HIV being all down low men being HIV positive, the data actually kind of tells the reverse story. So there was a study that was published, it's a little old, but what they found was that men who did not disclose their same-sex behavior were actually less likely to be HIV positive than men who didn't. So in kind of more common parlance, men who were out were actually more likely to have HIV than men who were in the closet. They were also less likely to have multiple male sex partners. So if you're having less sex, your risk of getting HIV is less. And they're also less likely to report having engaged in UAI, which stands for unprotected anal intercourse. Other studies have looked at this question of if guys are not out about their sexuality, does that actually increase their risk-taking behavior? And actually, studies show that no, that's not the case. So when you look at kind of what the research says is that non-gay identified men may be less likely than gay identified men to be HIV positive, and in turn are less likely to transmit HIV to female sex partners. So again, the guys that would be most likely to be having sex with women in addition to men are actually less likely to have HIV than the guys who are out. So again, that's totally the reverse of what the conversation in the public has been around the down low. And again, this whole notion that all Black men who have sex with men are on the down low, we do know again that Black MSM are less likely to identify as gay and are less likely to disclose same-sex behavior to others. And that's for a whole host of reasons that we could talk about a little bit later on. And there was, when we look at kind of national representative data, we found that only about 2% of Black men identified as bisexual. And we also know that some men who have sex with men and women are honest to both genders of their partners about what they're doing. And this is a really beautiful quote taken from my colleague, David Milbranch, who does lots of research on this issue. And I'll just let you read this. But basically, the take-home message was this, is that, he said he would be honest if a girl asked him about, if he was having sex with guys. And also, why is it that, the men always has to sort of be forthcoming, and it has to be sort of a two-way street that both partners should be sort of forthcoming in their past sexual history. So again, kind of adding a little bit of nuance around the fact that people don't actually have these types of conversations with their partners. So, all right, so if it's not the down low, why are we seeing such high rates of HIV in black communities and in black men specifically? So, well, it might be that, well, maybe there's something about black MSM and they actually engage in higher levels of risk behavior than men of other races. And actually, this has been a big paradox in the research literature, which actually finds that black men actually engage in lower levels of risk than white or Latino men. So there are lower levels of risk that can account for the higher levels of HIV infection that we find in black MSM. So if they're not having more unprotected sex, they're not having more partners, then, well, maybe it's because, black men are using drugs that may facilitate the transmission of HIV. And again, like the research says that that's not true either. So we actually find that black MSM use substances at rates that are lower than white MSM or comparable levels, and also don't use the types of substances that would lead to HIV transmission. So we're thinking about injectable substances, but also drugs that people use in the context of sex, like crystal meth, to enhance their experience. We find that white men actually use those drugs at much higher rates than black men. So again, it can't be about individual risks that fuels this disparity in HIV between men of different races. So what might these other factors be? So I think we're really quick to look at sort of these individual level factors. Like it must be that people are just being more promiscuous. That's sort of the kind of go-to analysis. But actually, in those of us that are in public health always try to look at sort of upstream factors and sort of what might be other things that are happening in the social fabric that may actually explain these disparities. So there's a couple of things that are kind of talked about, and the take-home message from this is that it's a lot of things. It isn't just sort of one thing you could point to and say, oh, that's why the rates are higher in this community, because it's really a complex web of factors. But some of the things that we know actually do play a role in this are higher rates of other STIs. And why might that be an issue? Well, we know that certain types of STIs, sexually transmitted infections, both increase the likelihood that you'll get HIV if you don't already have it, and also make it more likely that you'll transmit HIV if you do have it. So diseases that create ulcers, such as like herpes, if someone has herpes and they're having an active outbreak, if they come in contact with HIV, it's much more likely that they will actually become infected. So we know that there are higher background rates of STIs in black communities, and that might explain in part why we see higher rates of HIV as well. Another area, and I'm not sure if Dr. Adamora has come to talk to you yet, but she has or will come and talk to you, and she's one of the country's leading experts on HIV in black women specifically. And what she's found is that really a lot of it has to do with sexual networks, and what we talk about is sexual concurrency, which is just a really fancy way of saying that you're sleeping with a lot of people at the same time. So again, public health, lovely clinical terms to talk about sex. So sexual networks and sexual concurrency, why that's an issue is that because of the way in which people select their partners, so and the way that it works in this country is that black people tend to have sex with other black people, white people tend to have sex with other white people. So when you have these kind of racially homogenous sexual networks, and because there are fewer black people that are kind of in those networks, if you introduce HIV into a smaller network, the risk that any one person will come in contact with it is greater, but just because they have a smaller pool of people from which to choose. So we've seen that this actually is a really big driver of HIV, particularly in rural areas. So again, Dr. Adamora has done some really important work in eastern North Carolina. What they found is that in these communities where there are high rates of incarceration, where men are not available to women as heterosexual partners, the men can kind of have a lot of different female partners. And what that does is it creates sort of a network around this one guy. So if all the women are sleeping with him and he gets an STI or HIV, the fact that these women may actually also acquire it that way, and if they're sleeping with other men, we can sort of see how the transmission kind of spread in a small community, especially if you only have 20 people in which you're sort of choosing partners from. So these smaller networks, these more dense networks, actually facilitate the acquisition of HIV. There's been a question around sort of circumcision status, and does that make a difference? There have been a lot of studies, mostly done in sub-Saharan Africa, that showed a protective effect for men who are circumcised. So meaning that if you were circumcised, you're less likely to become HIV positive than if you're not. And again, I think given the fact that our epidemic in the US is more among MSM, and the evidence on whether or not circumcision is protective of MSM HIV acquisition is a little bit more mixed than it is for heterosexual men. So it's kind of like, there isn't really good evidence to suggest that's going to be a protective strategy here in the US, where I know in sub-Saharan Africa it's been promulgated as one of the kind of key tools to stem the HIV epidemic there. Another kind of paradox is that Black people actually get tested more often than other communities in the US. So there was a thought that, well, maybe it's because Black people don't get tested enough that this may be explaining some of this disparity. But actually, Black folks have among the highest rates of HIV testing in the US. But because the background prevalence of HIV is so much higher in Black communities, it's almost as though Black people have to test even more. So even though Black folks are at a higher rate of testing at baseline, because the prevalence is much higher, people have to test even more because there's still so much unrecognized HIV infection within Black communities. And that's really where we see people becoming infected, is because they are having sex with people who don't know their HIV status. So this higher rate of HIV, undiagnosed HIV infection, is really, really problematic. So I think these are also linked to other kind of broader social factors. So we know that poverty and lack of healthcare access really go hand in hand in terms of increasing people's risk for HIV. So going back to that issue of sexual networks, if you're in an impoverished neighborhood, that often limits your mobility both socially, economically, and sexually. So if you have a sexual network that's sort of centered in a high poverty area, again, just by virtue of living in that community, even if you're not necessarily doing anything more risky than someone living in a more wealthy area, your risk is higher just because of the background prevalence of HIV in your neighborhood. And if you don't have access to good health care, I'm sure Dr. Cohen talked about this issue of community viral load and sort of assessing kind of the amount of virus that exists within a specific community. So if folks aren't getting access to health care, even if they are HIV positive, they're going to have higher viral loads, which makes them more contagious to other people. So if you're not linked into good health care, that's actually not only bad for your individual health, but that's also bad for the health of the community that you live in. Incarceration is also another big issue. We know that the rates of incarceration for Black men in this country are astronomical, and these have far-reaching consequences, not just for the men who are being incarcerated, but also for their home communities. And again, that's tied back into the whole notion of sexual networks that I talked about earlier. And then also, I think homophobia also plays a role in terms of the stigma that people still associate with HIV, and that if you get tested for HIV, that must mean you're gay. And this whole conversation of just how that's still seen as being problematic. So again, and there's lots of research, and I'll talk about it a little bit later, about how exposure to these types of stigma is actually harmful for your health. So again, I talked about poverty and how that really does sort of concentrate risk within specific areas, and it sort of decreases people's access to good health care. So again, I think it's really important to not just think about this in terms of what are individual people doing, but what is their broader social environment like, and what kinds of opportunities and access do folks have, and that as being sort of an explanatory variable as to why they may be at high risk for HIV. So what do? I think I've given you so much depressing information. People are like, oh God, this is just so bad, But I think there actually are things that people can do, both on an individual level, but also thinking about how this can happen from a more sort of broad social action level. So I think and I'll just give this caveat here that given that I am training to be a behavioral scientist, I have sort of some reservations. I'm really excited about kind of the all the new kind of scientific breakthroughs that we've had in terms of biomedical HIV prevention. But they give me pause, and I'll explain that a little bit later on. But they are exciting in that these are massive medical breakthroughs. And again, you had your talk from Dr. Cohen, who is one of the leaders in the field on sort of biomedical HIV prevention in the world, and he's here at UNC. So there are a couple studies that came out, and I think you probably got briefed on most of them, so I'll just kind of go through these quickly. So PrEP, which is the idea that you give people HIV drugs before they are exposed, and that's going to be protective. And we actually have evidence that that is sort of something that can work. We also got some really great data about vaginal microbicides, and that this is a female-controlled type of prevention that women can use without having to ask their male partner for consent. And then often, you know, in Dr. Cohen's study, HBTN 052, which showed that if you treat people with HIV, that's going to make them less likely to spread HIV to their partners by a dramatic amount. So again, really, really, really important advances in biomedical technology and thinking about new tools that we can use in our fight against this virus. But I think it's also important to recognize that, you know, the efficacy of these prevention tools is really behaviorally dependent. So, you know, think about other conditions for which we actually have vaccines and people still don't take them up. So, you know, I think an analogous sort of situation is that we have the Gardasil vaccine for HPV prevention. And even, you know, that's not something that has universal uptake. So even if we have these tools available, you know, it's not a guarantee that these are going to be, you know, the magic bullet. So I'm excited about them, but I also have some reservation in the sense that, you know, when we think about kind of the notion of treatment as prevention, you know, that's wonderful. And if you think about PrEP, but I wonder that, you know, how willing would people be to kind of take the medication if they're not willing to use a condom, you know? So I think these are lots of kind of important issues that have to be thought out. I think just from a scientific standpoint, they are, you know, slam dunk, sort of amazing, exciting things. But I think it's important that we also think about kind of what are the implications for how we might roll these out on a broader population level. So, you know, who's going to pay for these? These are expensive medications, right? You know, HIV therapy costs about $12,000 a year. You know, are people going to be willing to spend that to, you know, prevent HIV? You know, so again, just some things to be thinking about. Another study that just came out, I think 2 days ago, also based here at UNC, Dr. David Margolis, he might be coming to speak to you as well. He is actually really involved in thinking about how we might cure HIV. So just some stuff that would have been unthinkable even 5 years ago. But actually, you know, he had some really wonderful data that came out that he was actually able to figure out how to get latent HIV to kind of be released from cells. And it's far more technical than anything that I can explain to you, so I'm not going to. But that's really exciting news and really good because we haven't been able to figure out how to do that before. So the biomedical science is really moving at lightning speed on new tools that we can add to our prevention toolkit. But, you know, again, just my personal sort of, you know, I'm excited, but I'm also like, well, how do we think about how these can actually be used in communities here in the States? You know, when we also have so much mistrust of medical institutions. So even if something like this is available, are people going to trust the medical institutions that will provide them these services? So I think there are a lot of things that have to be worked out beyond just sort of having the scientific evidence that these tools work. So I think, you know, there's a lot of room for those of us that are doing kind of behavioral work to kind of think about these issues, especially as they relate to disadvantaged communities here in the U.S. So there's a really great organization that if anyone's interested in kind of learning more about HIV in the Black community, it's called the Black AIDS Institute, headed by a really wonderful man named Phil Wilson. He's a good friend of mine. Has been doing HIV work since the start of the epidemic. And he runs the think tank out in Los Angeles. And every year they release these really wonderful reports. So if you go to their website, which is blackaids.org, you can download their PDFs, and they have lots of really wonderful kind of strategy documents. And a lot of the things I talked about, I pulled from their work. And so, last year marked the 30th anniversary of the first discovery of HIV. So, there's a lot of conversation in the media around it because, we've gotten 30 years with this virus. But it's sort of like, we're at this really critical point right now because we do have, treatment is really good, treatment is really good. We have all these exciting new biomedical tools that we can add to our toolkit in addition to sort of the tried and true, condoms and abstinence and other types of behavioral modification programs. So it's really, in the fact that we have people that are talking about curing HIV, these are all things that are way far beyond what we would have thought of 20 years ago or even 10 years ago. So, I think it's smart to think about how do we actually end HIV, and from the Black AIDS Institute, I'm paraphrasing some of the things that they thought, but I think these are actually really good sort of take-home points. The first, and this is something that everyone can do, everyone can learn their HIV status as early as possible. So I think when people don't get tested regularly, there can be these lapses of time where, oh, I got tested 3 years ago, but it's like, well, how many people have you slept with in the last 3 years? Are you transitioning into a new relationship? You need to learn their status then too. So getting tested once, 3 years ago isn't going to necessarily tell you anything about your current status, especially if you've had new partners in that time. So it's really important that everyone learn their HIV status. And then for those who are positive, to think about how do we link them into care. And that was something that for the last 5 or 6 years, I've been thinking about, how do you make sure that people get tested but also get bridged right into care? Because what we also know is that there is sort of this HIV continuum where people get tested but then don't get into care, or people get tested, they get into care, then they fall out, or they get tested, get into care, don't take their meds, so there are all these points at which we can lose people. So trying to think about how we make this a seamless process so that people don't kind of get lost in the cracks is really important. So, and I think, again, despite my reservations around some of the biomedical interventions, I think it's important to think about these things as how do we combine them? It isn't just going to be that a vaccine or a pill is going to be enough. These things have to kind of work in concert. So it's going to take people from all different disciplines thinking and working together about how do you design the most powerful type of HIV prevention possible. So it's not just going to be sort of just behavioral interventions or just biomedical. They have to kind of work together in concert. And I think as we think about kind of the Black community in particular, I think it requires that we have conversations with leaders of institutions that are relevant to the Black community. So oftentimes people will kind of go and say, oh, we need to get the Black church involved. And I think that is a crucial thing to do. And many Black church leaders have been on board from day one. But I think it's also thinking about, other institutions that serve young people. So how do we get sort of folks that are involved in sort of the hip hop community to kind of speak out on this? And there have been, people that have spoken very forcefully about the need for young Black folks to get tested and to get into care. So how do we kind of scale those efforts up and continue that conversation? So those are just some of the things that we can do. So, and just thinking about from a research standpoint, oops, I don't know why this is, there we go. One of the challenges that I've had as a kind of budding researcher is that so much of what we do and what we think about in public health is focused on a deficit model, what's wrong with communities, what don't they have, But when I look at the Black community, I see a very resilient and very strong population. I see people who are survivors, who are strong, and I don't think that we necessarily look to harness those particular aspects of resilience and how we think about designing interventions for communities. So I think we need to kind of turn our whole research enterprise on its head and think about how do we kind of build upon what's already working well in communities. So just to kind of think about this from a very practical standpoint, if we know that 46% of Black gay men are HIV infected, what are the other 54% doing that's keeping them from not being infected? And what can we learn from that population? So I think in some ways we just have to ask different questions than what we've been asking before to kind of think about, because obviously what we're doing now hasn't worked completely. So I think it's important to kind of not get mired in our old ways of thinking and think about some new approaches. Again, I think, interventions for Black communities here in the US also need to just make sure that we're attentive to kind of the unique social context and the fact that, HIV may not necessarily be top on people's lists, and it's not. There are so many other things that people are dealing with, and how can we sort of blend in HIV prevention into those other interventions dealing with other types of social issues? So, how can we think about how HIV prevention can be incorporated into kind of general education for school-age children? How do we think about tying that into food and nutrition programs that people are accessing? So I think, because when people have this sort of standalone HIV model, oftentimes that can create stigma for people. It's like, well, I don't want to go over there to get that service because that's where all the HIV people go. And I heard that over and over again, when I was doing work in the community here, that people just did not want to be identified. But if you can say, this is just a way for you to get all of your, kind of health check done. I know, I think California was offering HIV testing at the DMV. You're going to be there all day anyway, right? So why not just get an HIV test as well? So being creative and thinking about how we offer services is also another thing we need to be doing. And to kind of harken back to what I was saying before, I think the one group that gets left out of the conversation about sexual health and HIV in particular is straight men. There are thousands of programs that serve heterosexual women. There are programs that serve gay and bisexual men. But there's really nothing for straight guys, which I think leads to the erroneous assumption among many straight men that they're not at risk for HIV. So, but I think we in public health have to make sure that we're kind of targeting our interventions that also speak to the needs of straight men. So I think that's something that I think people are thinking about more, because there's this whole population that's been ignored. And, again, we're kind of unwittingly playing into this notion that, well, women must be getting it from gay men, because we're not really talking to straight men about, what they're doing, what they can be doing to protect themselves and their female partners. And again, the last thing I'll say is that we need to think bigger. I think so many of the interventions that are available for youth and communities focus on very small, one-on-one interventions or group-level interventions, which I think, work pretty well. But, when we think about the millions of people that we have to reach, doing a group of, 20 people in one area, thinking that's going to solve HIV in your community, that isn't enough. So we have to think about how do we do these kind of broader level structural changes that might allow us to have a bigger impact. And I'm happy to think through kind of what some of those things could look like in the question and answer period. So I just want to acknowledge some of the other people that I've collaborated with. Lisa Heitzer-Weidman, who I know came in earlier. She was my boss for many years and still a great friend and collaborator. David Mailbranch, who is at Emory University and is one of the kind of foremost thinkers on Black HIV. I got the Brokeback Mountain kind of clip thing from him, so I can't claim credit for that. And then Jonathan Lucas, who is the one that gave me the fresh off the press data from the ISIS study, and also the teaching team for inviting me for being here. And then the men that I spent 5 years talking with and getting to know and being a part of their lives that really brought me into the fold of HIV here in North Carolina. So I'll just close and ask for your questions.